Hello and welcome to Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. My name is Randall Bowling. I'm one of the docents here at Poplar Forest, and what we're looking at right now is Mr. Jefferson's wine cellar. Now, this was a very important part of his life because when he would come, he would make sure that he brought ample supplies for a good visit. He would have wines and ciders, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is the importance of cider in Mr. Jefferson's life. Now, as a docent at Poplar Forest, I do a tour. It's called Bottles, Barrels, and Casks, and I became very interested in the cider because Mr. Jefferson made a very, very fine cider at a time when no one knew anything about yeast and how it actually worked. So I became very curious as to how Mr. Jefferson achieved the quality that would please his discerning palate. And like all landholders of the day, Mr. Jefferson had orchards in Monticello, and like every other landowner, he would brag about his cider. And not only did he brag about his cider, he bragged about the quality of North American apples, of the Tolliver apple and the Newtown Pippin, which today is also called an Albemarle Pippin, both of which Mr. Jefferson used in making his cider. Now, the first boozy concoction of apple cider goes all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. And amazingly enough, when the Romans first arrived in the British Isles, they found the locals there already making a drink out of a local apple. Now, as the years went down, certain areas in Great Britain, France, Spain were noted for their ciders. However, cider had many different ways of making it, and many times throughout England, they would put raw products. They would put dirt in the cider. They would put raw bacon in the cider. And a lot of that cider was called pig squeal because that was the name, that was the sound that you would make when you take a sip of it. It was very rough, but it was very alcoholic. And this was during a time when no water was really safe to drink. Now, early in North America, on Jamestown, the colonists came with apple seeds and apple scions to graft apples, and one of the things they determined really quickly, there were no honeybees in North America. So the first shipments back into Jamestown included honeybees. Now in the north, the Mayflower came in 1620, and they had the first real provisions for cider, and there was a storm and one of the beams on the ship broke, and they used a huge metal screw used to press the cider to hold the beam together in time for them to get to Plymouth Rock. So they were ready to make cider as well. Now, we don't have any information that Mr. Jefferson actually made cider here at Poplar Forest, but in Monticello, he had orchards very specifically for cider making, and he gave explicit instructions to his staff how to do it. In the 1676, Nicholas Spencer, the Secretary of Virginia House of Burgesses, speculated on the cause of riots as having to do with cider. And he said, all the plantations flowing with cider, so unripe, drank by a litmus inhabitants, that they allow no time for fermentation but in their brains. So even at that early time, they started to regulate cider. Now, cider was also used in the colonies as a barter item. Kegs of cider would pay for a child's education. The earliest workers that built the roads in the United States were paid in cider. Now, Mr. Jefferson would make up to 270, 300 gallons of cider every autumn. He would bottle that into quart bottles, which would be about 500 quarts. Now, there were so many visitors at Monticello, and it strapped all of his capacity, so he would always buy extra ciders. Now, there's a special letter that Mr. Jefferson wrote to Fanny Brand, and he had sent one of his servants, is what he called his slaves. There were servants, and he sent them with 7 vials and asked her to send a sample of each cask, and that he would buy them based upon the quality. This letter exists, and we'll have copies of that. In Monticello, after they did the bottling, Mr. Jefferson, it was all hands on deck. Everyone at Monticello would help in the bottling. It was a 2-week process. And Mr. Bacon, one of the overseers, wrote that even Sally Hemings had to participate in the bottling of the cider.